webinar. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. You can see in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, there is a chat session. We invite you to introduce yourselves, what organization you're with, and where you're joining us from. As we go through the webinar, please feel free to type in questions, comments, and engage in a conversation. Part of the benefit from being on today's webinar is to gain knowledge and also have a chance to interact with your colleagues and other experts from around the globe. So thank you. Welcome. I'd like to introduce myself. I am Susan Patrick, the President and CEO for iNACOL and co-founder of CompetencyWorks. And joining me in the presentation today is Maria Worthen, our Vice President for Federal and State Policy at iNACOL. This work that we're focused on today is gleaned from studying best practices of education systems globally. The main idea around fit for purpose is asking the question, are our education systems fit for purpose in a modern world? The future is changing, and so too must education. This is not about tweaking industrial-style K-12 education models, but fundamentally rethinking education, its goals and purpose to build knowledge and skills that our students need for the future. The idea behind asking this question, is our system fit for purpose, will take not only thinking about the short-term implications, planning, but an articulation of a long game. And this is for practitioners and policymakers and organizations that are working to improve the future of education. The title is Fit for Purpose, Taking the Long View on Systems Change and Policy to Support Competency-Based Education. I welcome you today. So the agenda today, I will provide a brief introduction and go over 4 threshold concepts. I will turn it over to Maria to discuss issues to tackle, action steps, and along the way, we're happy to pause for some Q&A and respond to questions in the chat room. So moving on, our organization is a nonprofit focused on transforming education, learning from best practices across the United States and globally, and sharing those advancements in ideas openly. We host the iNACOL Center for Policy Advocacy, which provides research examining best practices in policy and helps governments, organizations, federal, state, and local education agencies and communities think through a way forward with action steps and recommendations. So the highlight today is focusing on a recent publication of research on this report, Fit for Purpose, which is available on our website, and we will provide the link to the report in the chat box. So to get started, just to level set, back in 2011, 8 years ago, we brought 100 innovators working on K-12 education and competency-based education together to level set. What is it we mean by this idea? The traditional system batches students by age through grades regardless of their readiness level and moves kids through the system based on time with huge gaps in their learning. The current system will pass students through with grades of A, B, C, D, and they may be missing 10%, 20%, 30% of more of their knowledge. No wonder we have students entering the 9th grade, sometimes 4 and 5 grade levels behind in literacy, basic English, language arts, and math. So what's the alternative? Thinking through a system that is designed for student success, a system where failure is not an option. Competency-based education systems have 5 distinguishing features, and all 5 must be present. Students advance upon demonstrated mastery. These competencies are explicit, measurable, transferable learning objectives that empower students. Students also develop a broad set of skills and dispositions along with academic content knowledge. Assessment is meaningful and a positive learning experience, and students, if they don't get it, get timely and differentiated support until they meet mastery. So therefore, they are moving on after they demonstrate mastery, then they move on to the next learning goal or the next level. So let's take a look at how competency-based education is taking hold in the U.S. Back in 2012, we see that states were starting to wrestle with how do we move from this industrial model of education to open up space for innovation in schools and districts. And there were roughly a handful of school districts in 2008. By 2012, we had a few dozen districts and states working to open up space for innovation, giving flexibility from seat time to competency-based education models. Compare this, by 2018, you see the growth in states opening up policy and supporting competency-based education models to more than 40 states or 43 states. So this growth is taking hold. This is a movement. Now the idea behind this paper on Fit for Purpose is to take a long view on what will it take to transform K through 12 education over a long term, not just 2 or 3 years, but over 10 or 20 years. We're going to talk about core concepts that policymakers might think about addressing to make this shift to more personalized approaches for students and adults, learners in the system, and a competency-based learning model, and explore how states begin to build system coherence across the system towards these new innovative models that ensure all students are ready for their future in the future of work, for their future in higher education, in colleges and universities, or technical training programs and certifications, as well as life, towards a society that is open, just, and trusted. So our long-range vision is for K through 12 systems that can prepare all students for success, and this will require sustained leadership, meaningful, and inclusive stakeholder engagement. We see competency-based education taking hold by educators and practitioners on the ground with communities asking important questions on what does it need? What do we need to redefine student success? What do we need to redefine what education needs to do? And what does a diploma mean in the future? So we envision a future state of education where all students are succeed, where they have personalized pathways through their learning, both inside and outside of school, that these new designs are grounded in the learning sciences and research on how students learn best and youth development, and that educators are empowered, capacity is built with educators leading the work, and that qualifications are meaningful and credentials mean the knowledge and skills have been mastered, and that we are engaging as a community in a growth mindset, knowing that all students can learn. So I will begin by putting out the idea of threshold concepts. When we were doing research on education systems globally, there are certain big ideas. Threshold concepts are core concepts, once understood, are needed to transform a given subject. So in K through 12 education, these ideas can help us think differently, challenge our assumptions about what is possible in an equitable future education system, one focused on equity for all students, with all students succeeding, that also address deep-seated system design flaws that we currently have in our outdated systems. These threshold concepts are the idea on what it means to actually certify meaning with a meaningful diploma or meaningful credentials, assessment literacy much more broadly than is being considered today. Pedagogical innovations based on learning sciences of how students learn best. And the core idea that we must meet students where they are, academically and holistically, and provide those supports in order for students to succeed. Now, if you look at those and compare that to the current system today, we're pretty weak on our conceptions around what it means to certify learning. Assessment literacy is very, very narrowly understood, and it's a broad field. We must wrap our heads around what this means for the future and a long term. What can innovation look like for teaching and learning with new kinds of pedagogical approaches, and what does that really mean to meet students where they are? So this paper, Fit for Purpose, digs into what we need to think about differently about a broader set of student outcomes and how a high school diploma could be meaningful, actually represent, and link to a demonstration of evidence of the knowledge and skills that students need to a more comprehensive definition of student success and alignment with their futures, future career pathways, future college pathways, and also what they need to be engaged, moral, ethical citizens. On assessment literacy, let's think more broadly about challenging our current notions of assessment. Student assessment can involve a variety of approaches, and it's essential to measure progress and performance of individual students on an ongoing basis. It's critical for a planning cycle for next steps for improving teaching and learning. It creates cultures of inquiry across teachers, looking at how they're analyzing mastery of student learning, and builds professional judgment and educator capacity. And it's engaging relevant stakeholders. So assessment literacy is something developed in students, in educators, even in parents and community, as well as practitioners. This idea is not well understood. In fact, only 1% of our teacher preparation programs, pre-service programs in the United States are focused on any aspect of this assessment literacy. So this is a threshold concept that we have to build. The knowledge and skills that are associated with designing, selecting, interpreting, and using high-quality assessments and performance assessments too, to improve this learning and these demonstrations of evidence of mastery serve important purposes in education and also in policy. When you get articulations, calibrations, where you get confidence of 95% in educator judgment, then you can start to really think differently about what transparency of student data and accountability look like well beyond where we are today or have been in the last 20 years. Second, the pedagogical innovations based on the learning sciences are constantly driving. This is an ongoing question to learn more about the evidence that's presented in research and how to develop teaching and learning cycles based on the learning sciences. This includes the whole child, social, emotional learning, and building knowledge and skills. How do we create safe, right, good learning environments conducive to doing what students need to do and opening up pathways that are highly personalized and inclusive. Last, meeting students where they are. Along with these personalized pathways in learning where students are taking on and demonstrating their mastery, are breaking apart subjects for more modular learning experiences, recreating those into interdisciplinary pathways and projects, providing those supports for students when and where they need them, having assessment strategies that are more holistic and that include performance assessment, and flexible scheduling, whether in blocks or allowing that learning to permeate into the community and to be recognized or certified back in school. So these ideas are learner-centered and offer pathways as well as supports. These are core threshold concepts in the future of learning that are needed for articulating a long-term game. How do we build that? And with that, I welcome your questions, and we'll turn it over to Maria Worthen. And thank you. Maria, on to you.
Thank you very much, Susan, and good afternoon to all of you, or good morning or good evening if you're calling in from a different time zone. We're so glad you're here. I also just want to mention my colleagues, Natalie Trong and Dale Frost, who are directors here with the Center for Policy, are in the chat room, and even as Susan and I are talking, we may miss some of the comments coming in. Nat and Dale are here and available to share their expertise as well on this paper and the work that's happening here in the U.S. So Susan talked about the issues to tackle. She talked about the threshold concepts, which are the concepts that we need to understand in order to think differently about a given subject. Once we have that mind shift, it's hard for us to go back thinking in the old way. It's really important. We want policymakers to be thinking differently, but policymakers tend to be very action-focused, and at some point they want to know, how do we take some steps towards actually tackling these threshold concepts? And so we included issues to tackle in the Fit for Purpose paper to give some food for thought about how policymakers and educational leaders and community members can think about taking some first steps towards actually moving towards a long view on systems change and policy to support competency education. So I'm going to walk through these 6 issues to tackle: redefine success, meaningful qualifications, accountability as continuous improvement, educator capacity for competency-based education, capacity to lead change, and competency-based systems. So the first issue to tackle is redefining student success. And this is an important starting point when states come to us and say, where do we start? How do we start moving towards this long-term systems transformation? In order to get to where you want to go, you need to know where you're going. And right now in the U.S. education system, the predominant way that we define success is in terms of reading, English language arts, and mathematics. And specifically, how many students are proficient at grade level on those subjects. In addition, we have the high school diploma, which tells us that students have put in the requisite seat time to achieve a passing grade in a number of subjects. But we don't actually know what they know and what they can do, nor do we know if they're prepared for anything beyond just fulfilling the criteria for graduation. So this is an important starting point as a North Star for transforming education to talk about what does it actually mean for students to succeed, not just in school but beyond, as citizens, community members, family members, employees, employers. What are the knowledge and skills that we want students to have to not only succeed but thrive? And in writing this paper, we looked at some different states in the U.S. that are taking this new path towards redefining student success. We looked at states like Virginia and South Carolina that are at the state policy level redefining success with the profile of a graduate. So in Virginia, they're talking about life-ready individuals that during their educational experience will have content knowledge, career exploration skills, workplace skills, community engagement, and civic responsibility. And while I think if you look at state policy across the country, you might see these ideals reflected in the policy, What's different about this profile of a Virginia graduate and the profile of a South Carolina graduate is the state is taking proactive steps to align the academic competencies, the graduation requirements, and also looking at how assessment can certify mastery of these competencies. So that is a significant next step that states can take. Another issue to tackle is meaningful qualifications, and this is very much related to this idea of redefining success. When we think about post-secondary success for students, we're really thinking about what is under the hood of that high school diploma. How do we make that more meaningful? How do we know that the high school diploma means that a student is ready for the next step, whether that's higher education, whether that's career, whether that's citizenship? And we have, in the paper, talked about also looking at a broader frame, looking internationally at qualifications frameworks, which countries not in the United States, but many countries outside the United States have defined what are the competencies and skills that are necessary to be successful in a variety of qualifications and career areas, and they're back mapping that to elementary and secondary education. So we think it's important to look to other countries, how they're thinking about aligning the pre-K through workforce to prepare students for success. Another issue to tackle is accountability as continuous improvement. And I'm going to pause for a second to give a little context. In 2015 in the United States, the Every Student Succeeds Act was passed. This was a rewrite of our Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is the federal legislation that defines the federal role in education. With ESSA's passage in 2015, it opened up a lot more flexibility for states to rethink accountability, redesign systems of assessment, redefine success, as I talked about earlier, and also rethink what it looks like for teachers to be prepared for learning environments for the future. And so another issue to tackle is this idea of accountability as continuous improvement. Under the old accountability regime of No Child Left Behind, which was the legislation that preceded ESSA, accountability essentially merged the concept of educational assessment with drawing a straight line from educational assessment to the consequences that and interventions that could happen to schools if they did not meet their benchmarks. That, unfortunately, while very well-intentioned and intended to close gaps and increase equity, and certainly we need to acknowledge some of the good things that happened there, that was limited in scope, because what it did was it caused a lot of educators and leaders to conflate accountability with assessment. When we think about accountability, what we need to be thinking about is a coherent and reciprocal system that drives towards continuous improvement, starting with a new definition of student success, including multiple measures in the rich number of domains that we want students to be successful in, and driving towards continuous improvement. And so this means thinking about accountability in a different way. It's not just about blaming and shaming. It's not just about consequences, but it's really about how can everyone in the system get what they need to help students succeed. Another issue to tackle as we think about meeting students where they are, or we think about the learning sciences and education with some of the threshold concepts that Susan talked about, is educator capacity for competency-based education. The model of education, this outdated model of education, is perpetuated by our outdated models of teacher preparation and development. And so in order to truly transform K-12 education, we also must transform the way that we prepare and support teachers throughout their careers in pre-service. And so as part of educator capacity for competency education, we need to model these personalized competency-based learning environments that we want students themselves to experience. This includes multiple pathways to educator credentials and development, educator competencies needed for personalized learning, defining what those look like, and assessment literacy and educator professional development. Now those first two that I mentioned, multiple pathways and competencies, we're beginning to see some traction. We're beginning to see some early adopters implementing early stage innovations in this area. We're seeing more pathways. We're seeing conversations about educator competencies. We're even seeing the first fully competency-based and personalized teacher preparation programs launching. But the lack of assessment literacy, which Susan talked about quite a bit earlier, and the lack of the confidence that we're putting in our educators to exercise professional judgment about where students are in their learning. This is something that's really holding us back, and we need to get beyond those threshold concepts to build capacity in our educators for a true transformation, and that's the only way that we are going to get to the future state that we want to get to.
Maria, if I can just jump in a second on this too, on the left, and there's been some conversation in the chat room on this too. Some folks, and if you're doing this at all, please feel free to type in the chat room, are starting to develop competency-based systems for educators and practitioners working in this. So identifying those competencies that are needed for modern education systems, for competency-based systems, and we're starting to see different pathways available and rethinking micro-credentials. On that right side are the areas where we're not seeing the resources being developed yet, not there yet with a growth mindset. And we want to shine a light on this. This is really important that we start having conversations and really dig in on best practices around the body of work for appropriate assessments and assessment literacy, and for building that calibration and moderation processes for educator professional judgment towards mastery too. So really want to highlight that all of these things are needed. Thanks. And those of you doing any work on the educator competencies and the adult competencies, please share where that work is happening in the chat room. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you, Susan. And yeah, I just this is also a good place to pause and look at some of the questions that might be bubbling up here from the room before we move into the next slide. I see that there's been some discussion around how the post-secondary transitions, which colleges and universities are treating competency-based transcripts the same, which raises questions about what is a competency-based transcript. Susan, do you want to talk a little bit about that and the work that the Mastery Transcript Collaborative is doing?
And please know I'm facilitating the chat room now, and feel free to type in your questions, Maria. We've been sort of addressing them in a conversation in the chat room as they come up. So I think we can continue to move on. But the idea around a mastery transcript is when states or when we define these broader definitions of success, that a transcript will include a full range of not just the academic, building the knowledge and having an evidence, for example, in any portfolio of that knowledge, but also the skills and dispositions. And that states, college admissions offices are are signing on and being really explicit that they're happy to evaluate mastery-based transcripts or proficiency-based transcripts. So that's a common misperception on whether those will be accepted or not. There is widespread acceptance across the higher ed community, and in many ways, the mastery-based transcripts give admissions officers far more information than a traditional transcript has. Also, there are some early experiments or some conversations happening in the K through 12 education, workforce pathways, career alignment space, where this idea of mastery transcripts can lead into multiple pathways, not limiting a student's pathway to higher ed, but also building up micro-credentials and skills to enter the workforce with essentially a basket full of knowledge and skills, and also that e-portfolio or portfolio to go along with that evidence. So some interesting developments on, I don't know if you saw recently, but Google and some other of the big tech companies out in California have said that they're now going to be hiring not based on a college degree, but based on that employability and skills, and build better pathways for all students to really change the way that employers look at hiring and developing their workforce and people in the long term. So really interesting. Back to you, Maria.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I do think it's important for us to make that distinction between what it means to have a transcript that reflects knowledge and skills versus one that's truly competency-based, and understanding the implications of that for policy. So I've talked about the issues to tackle, and now I want to talk a little bit about how do we get there. And certainly I know we have a lot of folks from around the world here, which is great. I want to sort of just, with full transparency, this paper was written with the U.S. education system in mind, but feel free to replace the word state with country or region or ministry. So how do we get there? We have this sort of mental toolbox. We have the threshold concepts to help us think differently about how education systems could be. We have issues to tackle, things to think about, levers within the system to push and develop. But states at the end of the day are going to have to begin to identify their own theory of change. There is no one way that this is going to happen. Sustained policies, sustained reforms will only work when stakeholders are truly engaged and involved. So a first step is just about bringing partners and stakeholders together to craft a vision for the purpose and future of their education systems. What is your vision for the future of education in which all students can succeed? Then thinking about what space currently exists in our policies for innovators who are working towards transformed and more equitable learning environments. What space do they already have? So, looking at states that have things like innovation zones, which allow districts to have certain regulations waived, for example, around seat time and credit hours, to pursue a competency-based learning progression. We're seeing states begin to implement new systems of assessments that are and being able to pilot them in a subset of districts, sort of outside of the statewide assessment model required under ESSA, under the Innovative Assessment Pilot. So where is the space in your policy where the frontline educators that are already thinking about transforming their learning environments, it gives them the space to do that? And then in order to build that work out in terms of quality, in terms of scale, in terms of continuous improvement, thinking about how states can build the capacity of educators and school leaders to transform learning environments to meet the needs of every student. As I said, teacher capacity is key. Without educator capacity, the policies are just going to stay on paper. They're just going to stay within a few frontline innovators. If we're not building the capacity of the individuals that are the ones that are working with students, with the educators, with the teachers, with the school leaders, we're not going to get to that long game of a system that works for every student. So after we published the corporate paper, we published another paper called Current to Future State, and which provides a bit more of an actionable roadmap for how states